Thanks very much, Jim. I can't remember if it was Wyn or Tom who took the wind out of my sails in my Nuffield interview by asking me why anyone should care about goats. But I think they're wonderful animals to farm, and my project grew out of my obsession with trying to find a way to graze my own herd of goats when everyone in the know about goats told me that you just can't graze them in the UK. There are about 1 billion goats in the world, and it's actually more widely consumed as a milk than cow's milk, Tom and Wyn. In the UK, there's 45,000 commercial dairy goats, and almost all of them are permanently housed. If you ask people why, you'll hear things like this. Because they are Mediterranean animals, so they can't tolerate cold and wet. Because they're browsers, not grazers, so they just won't eat grass anyway. Because they have poor immunity to parasites, if you try to graze a goat, it will soon be riddled with worms. Oh, and they're famous escape artists, so good luck trying to keep them contained in a field anyway. But I had been bewitched by the beautifully simple business case at the heart of pasture-based dairying. You have the grass in the field, and you have the animal who, unlike you or I, has nothing better to do all day than eat it. The animals love it because they get the sun on their backs and the freshest grass. The farmers love it because they save so much time and money by having the animal harvest their own feed. And we know the public are pretty keen on it too. I just had to give it a go. In 2023, though, when I was awarded my scholarship, Fraser and I were at something of a crossroads. We'd really outgrown our farm business tenancy in Oxfordshire. Demand for our cheese was outstripping what we could supply. Our herd was outgrowing our increasingly decrepit milking parlour. And we were doing our best, but we had 200 goats and less than 10 acres of grazing, so we were pretty limited on what we could ever achieve on that front. We really needed to move to a bigger farm or call it quits. And I have to admit, in March 2024, when I boarded that plane to Brazil for the CSC, I was erring on the side of calling it quits. We just didn't seem to be able to find a farm that it made sense to move our business to. The hand of fate seemed to be at work, though, in typical Nuffield way, and when I was in Brazil, my dad texted me to say that a farm he had lived and worked on in the 1970s was going to be coming to the market. Now, this one was a great farm. I still had grave doubts about whether the pasture-based approach could work with dairy goats, but in Brazil, meeting all these scholars from around the world, I picked up the mindset of, if you believe it, you can be it. And sorry, that is quite cheesy, excuse the pun, but I came back from Brazil, went straight off to view this new farm, and we decided to believe. And to cut a long story short, we moved our entire farm, herd, and family from Oxfordshire to Carmarthenshire. Logistically, doing this at the same time as all the Nuffield travelling was, frankly, a bit of a nightmare. But by God, it turbocharged my project because we had now staked all our money and the future of our business on me finding this mythical goat dairy-based pasture system. My study tour focused on countries that have similar climates to the UK, but larger or more traditional dairy goat sectors. And I particularly wanted to visit countries that had a larger proportion of their goats in organic production, as this is an area I see potential for growth in the UK. And I also wanted to learn lessons from our friends milking cows, so about a third of my visits were to cow dairy farms. My first major finding from my travels, that's a big sigh of relief here for me, is yes, I do believe there are grazing-based approaches that can work with goats in the UK. This is the first farm I stepped on for my travels. It's a 1,500 head organic milking herd in the Netherlands. In other words, there are more organic goats on that single farm than in the whole of the UK. Now, these guys were mostly grazing their goats because it was a requirement of organic certification rather than to make grazed grass the engine of their goats' ration. But still, they were doing it, and impressively, they reported no escapes, which does just go to show what you can achieve with that humble electric fence if you design it with a goat in mind. France is something of a mecca in the goat and cheese world, and they have about 1 million dairy goats there. But the really wonderful thing for me was being able to visit so many farms that were just like ours. Artisan cheesemakers with their own herds of 100 to 200 goats and grazing them outside as if it was a completely normal thing to do, believe it or not. The eagle-eyed of you might have noticed a photo of a goat eating, or grazing we might call it, grass as well. And I admit it's not actually the first time I've seen a goat eating grass, but the French have really perfected the art of cultivating a mixed sward, which is both palatable and nutritious for goats, typically including species like lucerne, clover, and chicory alongside the grasses. Goats are famous for climbing, but it was the cold, wet climates rather than the mountains that drew me to Switzerland and Norway. And I got my wish. In the photo on the right there, it is actually raining. And you can see that the goats haven't dissolved on contact with water. There are some interesting differences in the breeding approach between these two countries. Switzerland has about a dozen native breeds of goat, including some which are known for their hardiness. But Norway took a different approach and have a composite goat called the Norwegian dairy goat. It's these hairy little fellows on the right. They've created this by crossing various native breeds, but also bringing in Swiss and French genetics, the idea being a productive goat that is also hardy in the local climate. And I think it's an approach that could work well back in the UK too. It was also in Switzerland that I met this man who, despite grazing his goats every day for 8 months of the year, hadn't wormed a goat in over 5 years. And it's perhaps a good moment to mention that there was only one farm out of over 50 that I visited for Nuffield where they were having a significant problem with parasites. It was this farmer in northern Italy, but you can see he's still smiling. And perhaps that's because he hadn't given up on the idea of grazing, but was instead sensibly working with a consultant and making a plan for how to manage his grazing better next year. I go into a lot more technical detail in my report, but to summarise, I think there are 5 ingredients of successful goat grazing: careful planning of the goat's access to pasture, long rest periods between grazing to avoid parasite build-up, mixed swards that are palatable to goats, good electric fencing, and, familiar to the cow people in this room, breeding the animal you want. My second major finding from my travels is that those systems with the most promise start from asking the question, what would suit a goat, rather than trying to shoehorn a goat into a system designed for a sheep or cow. On this farm in northern Vermont, the goats were grazed in shrubby silvopasture during the summer months. Because they're eating at the level of the shrubs and trees rather than the grass, they avoid oral contact with worm larvae altogether. The trees provide natural shelter and are also highly palatable to the goats. Now, it wouldn't be easy to recreate this exact system overnight back here in the UK, but then my third major finding from my travels is that grass is never a free lunch, and this is equally true whether you're milking cows or whether you're milking goats. In fact, it was a revelation to me that many of the cow dairy farmers I spoke to could also recall a not-so-distant past when they too had been told that the grazing approach couldn't work in the UK because it was too cold and wet. And one farmer even recalled a physical fight with a neighbour on the topic. Those who are getting a lot out of pasture farm it with at least as much care and attention as they give their animals. They put capital into infrastructure to get the animal to the grass. They constantly measure and analyse their grass. And they breed a cow to milk from grass and not just for ever more milk. Now, like many a Nuffield scholar before me, I too had my big Nuffield light bulb moment. It didn't happen, as I thought it might, on a lush, high alpine pasture though, but rather on the M25 at 1 a.m. on a dark November night. I was on my way back from the conference in Belfast last year, where I'd heard a presentation by a scholar who had automated a parsnip packing line. Now, I know what you're thinking. A parsnip and a dairy goat are not that obviously similar. But what Jamie, this scholar, and I had in common was that we were both trying to change our systems. For Jamie, though, gallingly, it seemed like a case of job done, whereas I was stuck in an endless cycle of steps forward and steps backward, with a finishing line seeming very far away. And I started to wonder if there was something about a dairy farm that was rather different to a parsnip packing line when it came to trying to change it. After all, dairy farms are complex biological systems. They rely on routine and repetition and things staying the same from day to day and year to year. And I began to suspect these are things that could frustrate our attempts to change. I began to realise, this is my Nuffield moment alert, knowledge of the perfect system was only half the challenge. And what I now needed to become was a student in the school of system change theory. And my last major finding from my travels is, on a dairy farm where change is hard, if you want to change your system, you will need a system for change. I spoke to many farmers who had been through system changes on their farm and found 4 cross-cutting themes. The first was the importance of having a clear vision, and the most inspiring farmers I spoke to could summarise what their farm was about in a single sentence. For example, to produce milk from grass simply. Secondly, I noticed those farmers that were least stressed out by the change process were those who saw themselves as a resource. They consciously avoided piling themselves up with routine farm work and milking shifts, leaving time for hobbies and family, and therefore also leaving bandwidth for dealing with that decision-making and problem-solving that change inevitably brings up. Thirdly, I heard time and again about the importance of small changes that add up. It's tempting to wait for that huge opportunity to do a massive change which will perfect your system, but in truth, you will usually achieve more and risk less by just constantly asking, what can we change this week? As one farmer in the US put it to me, what is best is what is possible. And lastly, the importance of your support network, which might look like a few professionals, those one or two critical friends who you pay to give you advice you trust and to hold you accountable for what you've said you'll do. But no less important is the peer network, those like-minded farmers who are going through something similar to you, who you might meet in a discussion group or perhaps just in a WhatsApp group, as your contact with these can be truly transformative. So to summarise, I did start Nuffield secretly wondering if I was just barking up the wrong tree with all of this, but I don't usually think that now. There are definitely grazing-based systems that can work with goats in the UK, especially if we start by thinking about what suits a goat. And if we are always mindful that you don't get something for nothing with grass, and that system change on a dairy farm can be hard. So will everyone in the UK start grazing their goats now? Well, probably not, or not yet anyway, but I do feel the dial is starting to move already. I get told a lot less it can't be done, and I get asked a lot more, in fact, as recently as 2 days ago, how can it be done? On our own farm back home, for the first time, we've grazed our entire milking herd for a season. We've still got a lot of work to do on infrastructure, and we have not yet bred the perfect goat to milk from pasture, but we're well on our way. I now have my own WhatsApp group of grazing-based goat farmers in the UK, and Cormac and I are in the process of setting up a facilitated discussion group as well. So watch this space. And lastly, I'd just like to say a couple of massive thank yous to my sponsors for their generosity in making this possible, and to my wonderful husband, Fraser, who I couldn't have done it without, and I owe him a lot of time on the golf course now. Thank you.